Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Actually, before I get into today's topic, I will share a little bit of detail with you. A lot of my stories are around 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so. Some of them maybe just a hair longer or a little shorter, but on average, just to let you know, a video of that length can take somewhere in the neighborhood of 5, 7, 8, 9 hours or so to produce that content for you. It takes a while to research things and get a lot of details on paper. Sometimes it requires kind of writing out a script so that you don't forget any important details. It can take 2 or 3 times of recording it to get all the details right and have the flow right and not miss anything important. So, and then once that's done, then I have to edit and put pictures to it, which go, I generally pull a lot of the pictures from my extensive library of all kinds of places I've been all over the country. So anyhow, a lot of times when you're doing these stories from the 1800s, you're never going to have pictures of the original people unless they're super famous people. So anyhow, we do our best to give you pictures and images so you can kind of envision what this area that we may be talking about may look like and stuff like that. But the other thing to keep in mind too, I always try to get as close back to the source as possible. And a lot of times I'll use stuff from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, whether it's old newspaper articles and publications or things like that. So if we can get back close to 100 years to start with and get closer to that story and what the story was nearly 100 years ago, I feel like it's sort of like playing that telephone game when you were in kindergarten and you sat in a big circle and one person was told a story or some details and it had to pass around the circle from one person to the next, and by the time it got to the end the story was vastly different. So that can definitely happen when it comes to these kind of stories. So if I can get back to 19, 20, 30, 40 and be back almost 100 years and get the details as they were in print at that point, I feel like I'm getting a lot closer to the source. Then maybe you're only a generation or two away from the original person that told the story or so. But anyhow, with that being said, we will get on to today's topic. Today's topic is going to be like nothing we've ever done on this channel. And it's a great story, and you're going to want to listen until the very end because there's going to be a story that comes from 1940, and that story, there's been a lot more scientific research and other things that have happened since this story has been told back in 1940, and there's a lot more support for this story now than there was back nearly 100 years ago when this story was told. And this story goes back into the 1800s, probably at some point in the mid 1800s. So the story we're going to talk about today is going to be the lost gold-filled cave in Death Valley. And Death Valley kind of has lived in the American folklore really as kind of one of these mysterious places, mythical places. There's been a lot of travelers that have traveled through the area. Some have found fortunes here, and others have succumbed to the elements and the harsh environment, and many have just passed through on their way going somewhere else. And a lot of them, as they pass through this inhospitable, barren desert environment, a lot of them started coming in 1849, 1850. They started coming through this area on their way to California because of the California gold rush. And, some of them found that this area was very dry, extremely hot, very inhospitable, and was not a very pleasant place to be. And of course, there were prospectors that came through these areas too, and there were some great mines that had been found in this area, gold and silver and stuff like that. But the vast majority of people were just passing through on their way to better places in their minds. So, anyhow, as they passed through, I'm sure they were in awe of how expansive this desert, harsh environment was, and they just wanted to make their way through, get on to the more lush parts of California, and leave this barren wasteland in their minds, leave it all behind them. But we have a story that comes to us from a 1940 writing about it, and it is, I guess, told by the Paiute Native American tribe, and it was initially told by a gentleman that lived through this story, and he tells this story about what happened to him and his brother, and then the story just kind of lived on in the Paiute storytelling traditions. And this story likely takes place sometime after the gold rush, so sometime after 1850, but before the majority of the Paiute Native Americans got moved onto the reservations and out of this area near Death Valley. And I believe a lot of my research there looked like it was late 1870s, maybe by 1880, the majority of them were moved out of this area. So this story likely takes place in the 1850s, 1860s, possibly 1870s, but somewhere in that time frame. So that's kind of what we're looking at there. But according to the story, the two brothers, they were Paiute Native Americans from a tribe nearby. They had camped in the Death Valley area, and I'm not sure what they were doing in the area, where they were going, but when they got up in the morning, they had realized that a couple of their horses had escaped from camp during the night. So now they had to make their way, down following the tracks and everything. They had to make their way towards finding their horses. And it was said that they were on the west side of one of the many different dry lake beds in the Death Valley area. Now, there's a lot of them. Death Valley is very low in elevation. It's the lowest point in the U.S. It's below sea level. So a lot of these monsoon rains, when they happen, drain down into some of these basins, and these lakes, these shallow lakes or ponds, just sit there for quite a while until the waters are absorbed back into the deserts. So there is a lot of dry lake beds of different sizes in this area, so there's no telling which dry lake bed they were at. But anyhow, they made their way on the west side of the dry lake bed that they were camped near, and they followed whatever tracks they could find from their horses, and they're going off in the distance and looking for their horses. And a little ways off in the distance, they saw a little black dot on the hillside or the mountainside. And as they came closer and closer, they realized it was more of a big rock overhang. And by this point, they had been searching for their horses for quite a while now, didn't have any luck yet. So they decided that this would be a great spot to rest and get in the shade and cool down and get out of these summer heats and just the temperatures. And if you know anything about Death Valley, these temperatures can get into the 120s. Some of the hottest temperatures that have been recorded in the United States are here in Death Valley. The temperatures get even worse than they get when you hear about Phoenix, Arizona, and the high temperatures here. Death Valley can pretty regularly top that. So not unusual for the temperatures there in the summer to be in the 110s and getting into the 120s. Anyhow, so probably a pretty hot day as they're looking for their horses. They spot this area that looks to be a good shady spot where they can sit in the shade, they can cool off, maybe drink from their canteens, figure out what they want to do at this point. And anyhow, so they get to this overhang of rocks and they go sit in the shade there, and they're starting to recharge their bodies. And as they sat there and rested, they talked a bit, and they realized that it was actually a little bit more of a cave, and there was also a bit of a cool breeze that was coming from deep within. And so some of these breezes, as they kind of pushed out of this cave, almost like the cave was breathing, and you would get these breezes that would push out, and then it would stop, and then the cave would breathe again and push out some more nice, cool air. So as these breezes would push past them and cool them off, there were times where they would hear the sounds of some running water coming with the breeze as it came out of this cave. So they went to the furthest back point that they could go to in the back of this overhang or small cave, and at this point, they couldn't get very far back, but they had found that there was a passage back there, but it looked like a lot of the limestone ceiling or top of this cave had caved off and mostly blocked off access further back into the further reaches of this cave. So they discovered it was impossible for them to get further back into this cave, and they knew there was something back in there. It was impossible to get to unless they spent a little bit of time moving enough limestone to make a narrow passage to slip past, all of the caved off limestone from the ceiling. And so they spent some time doing that, moving some big chunks of limestone away so they could make a narrow passage so they could then squeeze past and go further back into this cave and try to see what was back there. So as they lit their torch and they explored back into the depths of this cave, they were walking down this passage, and they started to realize they were kind of going in a downward direction. It was sloping downward, and then things opened up, and their torch showed a large cavern. And this large cavern had an area of it that had a pool of water at the bottom. It wasn't said to be a huge pool of water, but a decent sized pool of water, not just a trickle or anything like that. So they get to the bottom of this pathway, and cavern opens up. They see this pool of water, but it's pretty dark. They can't really see into the water very well, and every once in a while, they see the water start gurgling and bubbling up from up below, and it would get a pretty vigorous amount of gurgling and bubbling up from somewhere down in the depths of the earth. But the water was too dark to see really too much. But one thing they did notice was that when this water would gurgle up and bubble up like this, and sometimes pretty violently, it would also bring with it some very heavy black sands. And these sands would be deposited on the layers of limestone that were sort of like steps leading down into this dark pool. There were these shelves of limestone, and they would get covered in this dark sandy, sand that looked pretty heavy. So if the sand didn't make it onto the steps, they would see it kind of falling back into the abyss, and then that sand would be brought back up with the next time that there was a forceful upheaval of the water. So one of these two Native American brothers decided that he would scoop up a handful of this dark black sand, and he took it outside into the sunlight to have a better look at it. And once he was outside, he noticed that there, in these black sands, they were full of gold flakes and small, well-rounded, well-worn little gold nuggets. So he came back into the cave to tell his brother, and of course, his brother was extremely excited when they found out that these black sands were full of gold flakes and little gold nuggets. And I'm sure at that point, they thought, hey, we're probably going to make a lot of money. We might become rich. This is a great discovery. And I know back in a lot of these days, it was said that a lot of the Native Americans didn't care too much about the precious metals. But I think as the California gold rush started and a lot of other things happened with gold, I think a lot of the Native American people started to see the value of these precious metals and what it could get them in exchange for goods and food and things like that. So a lot of that stigma or that idea of this stuff wasn't that important to the Native Americans. I think in the later 1800s, a lot of documentation shows that there were Native Americans that would then, trade with, pieces of gold or silver or nuggets or things like that in the general stores and stuff like that. Maybe many years prior to that, that may not have been the case. But anyhow, with that being said, I'm sure they were extremely excited by their discovery, by this gold-laden black sand. And, of course, they scooped some of it up, and they knew that they were going to need some more supplies to remove a bunch more of this out of this cave. They also were realizing that they had spent a lot of time in this cave, moving the limestone and exploring and talking and everything, and they realized that it was going to be dark pretty soon, and they knew they better get back to camp before dark. So I'm sure they made mental note of where this particular cave was, and they decided they better just make their way back to camp. Now, it doesn't say at this point if they ever found their 2 horses or not, or if they just decided they better get back to camp, or if they had more than a couple of horses that they were, they lost a couple, and if they just decided they had more exciting business to tend to now. But either way, they made their way back to camp, and then they decided they would keep their discovery secret for the moment, and they would make their way back to their Native American village, and they would get supplies, and they would make a return trip to the cave. And on their return trip, which wasn't very many days later, they had horses, they had a wagon, they had a bunch of sacks to hold all of this sand that they were going to retrieve from the cave. And they went into the cave, and they found at this point that the water level was much higher than when they had left from that prior visit. And so even though the water level was a bit higher than when they had left before, the water was still bubbling up, it was still creating some waves on the shore, it was still depositing the black sands, and it seemed that the waters were almost connected somewhere to like some tides or something deep within the earth, because there would be these waves and these patterns of the gurgling water and everything. And so they just felt that there was something more to this cave. But anyhow, they weren't too concerned about that at the moment. Their main concern was to extract some of that gold-laden sand and, become rich. So at this point, they were able to fill their sacks with a lot of the black sands. And once they had enough sacks of gold-laden sand, or they had filled up all the sacks that they had brought, they used their dimly lit torch to explore the chamber some more. And they could see there were some areas of large, crystal-looking, beautifully colored rocks that were hanging down from the ceiling, and they sparkled in the light from their torch. And it doesn't sound like they could reach any of this stuff, but they were just in amazement at at the beautiful rocks and crystals that were forming in this cave. And so as they looked out into the pond from the other side of the pond that they were at in this big cavern, they saw there was a small rocky island in the middle. And it didn't look to be too far, so one of the brothers decided to swim for the island. The torch was lighting it up enough, so he thought he would swim over to the island and see what was on the island. Maybe they would find some big gold nuggets or something over there. So as he got about halfway there or so, the water started to shake violently, and the water level dropped quite a ways in the chamber. And the Paiute brother that was swimming, he just disappeared into the abyss. And the other brother, he remained standing on the shore and just watched and probably couldn't believe what he just saw. And the water levels would continue to rise and fall, but he never saw his brother again. His brother just disappeared into the black water of the abyss. So the brother that was on the shoreline, he stayed for a couple of days and was trying to look for signs of his brother, see if his brother ever appeared, or just, I guess, probably couldn't believe what happened. But after a couple of days, he never saw his brother again. His brother never reemerged or anything like that. He never heard anything, and he realized his brother was gone. He must have drowned in the water, and he didn't really know what specifically happened to him, except he probably got sucked down into the abyss somewhere. So when the surviving brother returned, he had to tell the elders what happened. And this Paiute brother, he told the elders, and the elders, they basically believed that you should never go back to a place that had taken the life of one of your own. And they saw this cave of these golden sands that was located in Tomesha, or that was a native term for ground of fire, which was the name that they called Death Valley. They saw this as a bad or evil place within Death Valley. And so this surviving brother, he never did go back to this area. He heeded the warning of the tribal elders. They said this was an evil place. He saw that it took his brother, and that if he returned, he didn't know, is this place going to take him next? So he never returned to this place. But his story did live on in the tribal stories, and it had been told many times through the years to a lot of the Paiute tribal people. And that's where this story had survived to be documented about in 1940, where I found this specific account. Now, this specific account that was just read is approaching 100 years old already, and probably at the point that the story was told, it may have been 80 years old, 70, 80, 90 years old at that point. So anyhow, but it is nice to get the story as it was told, probably in the 1930s, because this story came from very early 1940, so it was in print back then. So with that being said, I mean, we do know that the story likely is from probably the 1850s, 60s, 70s, somewhere in that point. But with this story, there are a lot of people that may want to argue that it seems far-fetched that Death Valley, one of the driest places on Earth, would have a cave with a huge water source in it from deep within this barren desert wasteland landscape. A lot of people just didn't believe that this would be the case. And in 1940, when this story was told and was documented, many people probably felt exactly this way. But there had been talks here and there about caves in the Death Valley area that not only were they caves, but they turned into underwater caves and had tunnels and passageways and just tons and tons of water that went on forever. People just didn't want to believe that there was these watery abysses in the most desolate, driest landscape in the whole country. It just didn't make sense to a lot of people, so most people just didn't believe it. But there had been some people that said they had explored some of these subterranean caves or swam in them and that they were there. And there was one that in 1961, and I don't know how long before that it was discovered, but we're talking about Devil's Hole. It's in Death Valley. It's on the Nevada side of Death Valley, very close to the California border. But some scuba divers finally went in to that one in 1961, and they went down in Devil's Hole, and this was like the first exploration of that with like scuba divers. They didn't go down super deep. I believe they went down about 70 feet or so at that point, and this was February of 1961. But 70 feet was, pretty deep. They could tell that it went significantly further than that. The water temperature was said to be 93 degrees Fahrenheit, so it felt nice and warm. And it was known that this hole looked to be particularly deeper than that. But the government didn't really want any other people going in here, so at some point along the way, they put up some fences around Devil's Hole to make sure people wouldn't sneak in here and swim around or dive or whatever, but you know how that goes. That keeps the majority of people out, but you're going to have some people that still find their way in, and that's what happened in 1965. There was a group of teens that went with their scuba diving gear to Devil's Hole. And the first teen, his name was Paul. He dove in with his scuba gear and he never came back up. So one of his other friends, David, jumped in to find him, and he never returned either. So at this point, none of the rest of the group went into the water, and I suppose at this point they went to, law enforcement and a team of professional divers were then sent to go here and do a recovery operation. And during this recovery operation, there were multiple professional scuba divers that went into Devil's Hole, which is more or less like a cave that then opens up into this area of water that just goes pretty much like straight down. One of these divers, his name was Jim Houts. He went down first quite a ways, and he got to a certain point where he didn't feel comfortable going down much further. At that point, he dropped a weighted line down into the chasm, and it went to a depth of 932 feet, and it did not hit the bottom. So Jim titled this expansive chamber as the Infinity Room. So at this point, I believe Jim may have been right around the top of the Infinity Room, but it sounded like he did not want to descend into this big open chamber, because at this point he said he could feel there were some strong currents down there, and it appeared there was only narrow access in and out of the chamber, and if the currents wouldn't allow you to swim back up the narrow access, you could get trapped in this room and never be able to find your way or outswim the currents to get yourself back to this narrow passage to swim back up to the surface. So he didn't go any further at that point. But he was deep enough at that point that once he came out, they kind of figured out what depth he was at, and they added the 932 feet to it, and they figured that they knew that the depth of the cave at that point was at least 1,247 feet deep. So this water went a long way into the abyss. We had no idea how far it went. In March of 2012, there were some researchers there, and they were, checking on the water and other things. There's also I think it's called a desert, or there's like a little fish that lives there. That's one of the rarest fish on Earth. There's only a few hundred of them left. It's like it's called like a pupper fish, a specific variety that only lives in this cave. So there's been a lot of research going on here, and there were research scientists there, and they may have been checking on populations or just making sure. I guess it's difficult to check on populations of these pupper fish that live in there. Not puffer, but it's pupper, like a puppy. Anyhow, and so there's been a lot of research. They protect this area, but in March of 2012, there was a 7.4 magnitude earthquake about 2,000 miles away in Oaxaca, Mexico. And the scientists that were there had noticed that, because they were there at this exact time, that earthquake caused the waters of Devil's Hole to rise and fall and undulate in the neighborhood of about 4 feet. So the waters went up and down about 4 feet at that exact time that this earthquake was going on. So we don't know how far these underground water systems are connected, but it appears they might be connected a heck of a long ways and way outside of the Death Valley area. And so there could be some dark abyss that these cavernous waters go. Who knows how many, hundreds of miles or thousands of miles. But it's crazy that a earthquake 2,000 miles away affected things here. So that is the story of the cave with the black sands that were laden in gold somewhere in Death Valley, somewhere close to the west side of a dry lake bed. If you have any comments, you can leave them in the comments section, and thanks for listening.